audience room either? Okay, well, welcome. Let's get started. All right. Hi there, welcome. Come in and find a spot. All right, so I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see that. David, do you want to uh, show the audience to make sure they can see the screen?
I can see it.
We are practicing with our new technology today. Any of those are fine. All right. So Andrea, can you hear us? We'll have you be the sample,
Yeah,
and
I
can you
can.
see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. All right. So you can go back then, David, or Nels to the other one. All right. So we are going to begin. So our topic is living faith in a time of crisis, Midvale's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the opening verse we have here is, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near." So as we start, I think this is a great verse that we can hold on to through these days, that even as we experience difficulties and the trials of the last year, there are ways that we can find to rejoice in what God has been doing. And I think the idea of rejoicing and being gentle to one another is so important, because so many of us have felt at our wits' end, or burdened and anxious. And so we all need that extra tender care and gentleness to care for one another. And so this is a good verse for us to begin with, I think. "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near." So we'll begin doing our presentation sort of with a timeline, and I'm going to have Laura sort of describe some of the things that happened just as the COVID pandemic was coming into our knowledge and into our understanding.
So if you think back to last Lent, we were still, or not 2 Lents ago, we were still having soup suppers with worship following. And we heard about something happening out in New York City. And I can remember staff talking, "Oh, do you think it's in our community yet?" I was like, "No, we don't think it's here yet." But we knew something was coming. To be on the safe side, even though they weren't reporting cases in the Madison area yet, we instituted a policy of no self-service, which meant a lot of extra volunteers at the soup supper to wear gloves and hand you everything. And at hospitality, we did the same thing. We were printing off signs, putting them in all the bathrooms, trying to just stay as safe as we could, not knowing what was going to happen. Pam in the office began trying to stock up on hand sanitizer, plastic gloves, and cleaning products. It was not always an easy thing to find. It got harder because there were limits. You could buy one container of wipes, or you could buy 4 small bottles of hand sanitizer. But she kept at it, and somehow she kept us really stocked up. Most of us thought this would just be a few weeks, right? It would come, it would go, and it wouldn't disrupt us too much. But by the middle of March, we knew this was here. And so March 15th, 2020 was the last in-person worship service we had.
That was a really interesting weekend, because that was probably the only weekend where we had our highest attendance on Saturday at 5. And then by Sunday morning at 8, the people had started to think, well, maybe we shouldn't be gathering in groups. So we had a smaller group. And then Sunday at 10:30, we maybe had a dozen people, which normally we would have, almost several hundred at that service. So that was a very eerie morning in that sense. And that was the last in-person worship we had for about 14 months, I think.
And then the church building got locked up because we didn't want people coming in. Staff started working from home, and it just got very eerie very fast.
And I think you all remember that time. One of the things that we struggled with, especially early on in the pandemic, as Christians, we have two great commandments: to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And the way that we often express that love of God on a weekly basis is by gathering for worship and praising God and receiving the good news of God's love for us. But we discovered as this pandemic began that to love our neighbor meant that we couldn't love God in the same way that we had been used to. And I think that was really a hard thing for us in so many ways, that the best way to love our neighbor was not to gather for worship in the typical way that we would and praise and love God. And so this was our newsletter cover from April of 2020. And I just have a quote from my lead article in that edition that says, "As Christians, we are people who live by these two great commandments. We find ourselves in a strange time when the central act of expression of love of God, our worship together, is in direct contradiction to the command to love our neighbor. In this moment, a holy act of love for neighbor, refraining from gathering, is no less a holy act than coming together. At this time, loving our neighbor looks like an empty church. It is a strange image that we would have never imagined just a month ago." And I think for all of us, this has been a strange time, but it opened us to experiencing the Holy Spirit and God's presence and worshiping in new ways. And we'll talk about some of those coming up. So as Laura had said, we got this hint that things might be happening, and then all of a sudden things were cut off. And then we had to figure out, after we stopped worship in person, what do we do? Hang in there is one thing, right? That was about all we could do, but I'll let Laura go through some of those initial steps.
I think the big question that came up is, how do we do and be church when the central thing we do, gathering for worship on a Sunday morning, is not a safe thing to do? How can we do this? How can we still worship when we can't gather? We had our first online worship March 18th, 2020. So remember, the last Sunday worship was March 15th. By that Wednesday, when we were going to have Lenten worship, we were online. We did hold an evening prayer, and Brenda held her iPhone. I think the first service might have been recorded sideways.
At least the first half of it. And then we realized, oh, we need to switch the phone the other orientation.
But we had a musician, and we had a vocalist singing the lead part of Holden, and another vocalist singing the congregation part of Holden. And we just forged ahead. We knew that we had to figure out, how can we disseminate this recording then? We basically had 1 week to learn how to live stream on Facebook. So that learning curve was straight up for us because we hadn't done that before. Then Brenda managed to find a camera that came on a tripod, kind of like what we're using here in person, a special camera that she could tape the worship service and link it into Facebook. That camera was great. We thought that was a big step up from a handheld phone, but Brenda did have to move the camera by hand. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but once in a while you would see the camera kind of get picked up and carried and turned this way to show the musician, and then turn that way to show the altar, and then turn that way to show the pulpit. But then already by June, we had bought a more permanent kind of camera system, and it was installed. And I remember people saying, oh, the picture is so much clearer. The sound is so much better. And that's what we still continue to use every Sunday. So yeah, in 3 months, we had 3 different kind of protocols for taping our worship. Um, we were all feeling a lot of loss at that time. I think that's continued but the kind of the beginning senses of loss that we were feeling is the loss of gathering together, being together as a community of God. A lot of us felt very keenly and deeply the loss of singing together. There aren't a lot of places in society anymore where singing and people coming together to sing together happens. Church is one of them, and we miss that. We miss being able to share Holy Communion together. And also Pastor Ken, our pastors, our care team, our home communion ministers suddenly are not able to do in-home visits safely. So there was also that loss for people that really needed to be connected with some special kinds of visits. And we felt exactly like that cat.
Mhm. Yeah, just barely hanging on, and I think that's come and gone in waves throughout this whole time, right? Where we feel like at certain points, oh, I'm getting it, I can manage, and then we get back to a place where we're just barely hanging in there again, and it's just going up and down a lot, even through till today, I think.
And I think one of the things that was part of that learning curve I spoke of is things that we knew how to do as part of our jobs here. We couldn't do them the same way anymore. So we had to not relearn, we had to create new ways of doing things. And so new routines. And so nothing was the same. Everything was new. How are we going to do this? Usually at this time we'd be doing that. Oh, how are we going to do that? So there was a ton of creativity happening all through the pandemic. I think that's one of God's gifts, not just to churches, but all around. That the gifts of creativity have come out in really amazing ways throughout the pandemic.
So this was the May community cover, and it sort of captured some of the things that we really grounded our ministry on as we focused on how do we be a church, how do we lead our congregation in this time. And the first thing we remembered, we knew this in some ways, but we really discovered it during this time, is the church is not a building, that the church is the people. We continually say, we are the body of Christ, that we have been given that spirit in our baptism, that every time we hear Christ's word, we receive communion, we are again transformed, we take Christ upon us, and that we are God's hands and feet in the world. And so when we leave church, it's not like we're leaving church, it's just the church has left the building, is the way we would often say it in the past, but never really maybe sunk in as much as it did during this time, that the church is not a building. A focus for our ministry was that we wanted to keep connected to God and to one another. So how could we, dispersed as we were, stay connected? And it really is a blessing and an amazing thing that this pandemic happened after we had these technologies. If this would have been even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to stay nearly as connected as we were during this time because of the way we can connect through the internet. And it really has been a blessing. And so we continually tried to say, how do we keep connected to God and to one another? How do we do that through the online worship, through different ways of communicating, and through other ways that we can connect small groups of people or other opportunities to pray for and reach out and hear what people are experiencing. But that was our primary focus. And then to bring ministry to where the people are. You may remember, but we started doing a lot of pickups at church. We would have pickup days where you could come and get your devotionals or other things. And we tried to figure out ways that we could take the palms and have people come and take them home for Palm Sunday worship, so that they could get a sense that they were connected and they could still have that experience of worship and connection in their homes. And that the constant presence of God with us, that we knew we were not abandoned, we were not doing this on our own, and we knew that God would be walking with us and guiding us and inspiring and stirring us and comforting us when we needed it. And so those were sort of our key focuses during this time, to try and figure out how do we go about ministry in this completely strange situation, and that we belong to each other. And that was, I think, a key, is that whatever we did, we wanted to make sure that we cared for one another and kept people safe, and focused on how do we keep us all together and keep us through this time as a church. So I think those were some really important focuses that we had. And there was one other thing but I can't remember it. So after Laura starts talking, I'm sure I'll remember. So we'll go on to, oh yeah, so then it was sort of like we were the cat that had to let go of that branch and just believe that God would take care of us. And one of the verses that Pastor Katie had lifted up in May and June was this one: love casts out fear. And there was a lot of fear during this time, not only from the pandemic and from getting the COVID, but from the way in which we become more and more separated in our society and politically and in so many ways. And so we needed to remember that God's love casts out fear, and that it lets us engage with one another in ways that are caring and meaningful, and that we know that we can make it. We know that we will get through this time. And so we let go and believe that God is with us.
So the big thing, one of the big focuses is how do we stay in communication with all of you? And some of these things we had been doing before the pandemic, like using the telephone, the US mail for mails, for the letters and newsletters, using email, and to a certain extent on Realm. But we had to learn some of these other things. And some of us took to that more quickly than others. I am not an early adapter. So we had to learn Zoom. And we eventually, developed some documents so that we could teach members of the congregation to use Zoom. We had developed a much bigger Facebook presence, not just with online worship, but just trying to make sure that we were posting on the church's Facebook page. We also started a Facebook group page where you ask to join the group, and a moderator accepts you, and a lot of things can be shared there. And then we had to learn how to deal with YouTube. How can we take some of our recordings, whether by Zoom or on somebody's phone or whatever, and put those up on YouTube so that people in their homes or wherever they are can see them. So yeah, the first 4 we were pretty good with. The last half, we pretty much learned as we went.
Yeah, I remember Brenda Goebel and I set up a Zoom account for the church within a week of the pandemic. And it was a whole new learning experience where we had to try and do all these tests. And now we're doing this hybrid meeting where we have people in Zoom and people in person. The Facebook group, if you haven't joined it, if you're on Facebook, is a private group just for church members. So that's more of a place where people can interact with one another as members, whereas the Facebook church public page is more sort of our public presentations that are for the whole community or for anyone who would like to see. And then the Facebook group is more if you have questions or you want to share something or you have thoughts about your faith or other things. And then our YouTube channel, we have recordings of these adult forums are all on there. So you can go to our YouTube channel and click on a section called playlists and find the adult forum playlist. And you can go back and look at all of the recordings of our online adult forums, and then we have music and other things on there as well. So there's lots of interesting things that you can do, and that this really prompted us to do these things that we had never done before. And I think we've discovered value and will continue to do them. Hopefully, once this whole season is over, some of these things will still be valuable for us.
I do remember moments where at some point for everybody in the staff, we were tearing our hair out as we were trying to figure out things. So it's like, who knows how to do this? Does anybody know how to do that part? But I remember lots of tearing our hair out in frustration as we tried things and couldn't get them to work, and then tried to come up with new ideas and try those. Uh, yeah, I feel there was lots of, I don't know, weeping and gnashing of teeth.
One of the ways that we wanted to keep people connected is through what we called Midvale stories. And so we invited people to share their experiences, especially during the first few months of the pandemic, when we were told that we were to shelter in place and that some of us were safer at home and others were essential workers. And so we wanted to be caring and protect those essential workers by being safe at home. And so we invited members of the congregation to share, and you can look these up on our church website. If you go to the Midvale website, midvalelutheran.org, and on the far right, there's newsletters or news and events, and then there's a blog, and you can find all the Midvale stories there. But these were just a few pictures that were sent in along with some of the stories. On the let's see, upper left is Becca Burnett, who's a pharmacist in the community with her husband Dan. And then on the upper right is Ben and Kristen Ho. Ben is a ER doctor in our community. Below them, Don and Koki Klimpel, who are at Attic Angels and were safer at home, and talked about what that experience was like. And then we had in the other picture, Maggie Larson, who is a physician, and her family. And Maggie's even with us today. And just reading how our members were experiencing the pandemic. And these are just 4 of probably 30 different stories that we shared over the months. Was really a powerful way to connect and see what it was like to be on the front lines, or what it was like to be, at home, somewhat isolated, but finding ways to stay connected. And so I think people really appreciated hearing from our own members and staying connected in that way. And so it reminds us of how meaningful it is to share our stories with one another.
Got to be about summertime of 2020 that it really began to sink in that we were going to be in this for the long haul. Where at first we were very much focused on how do we worship together. By the summer of 2020, we were feeling like we had accomplished a lot, learned a lot, and what we were doing seemed to be working. So we would keep doing that, but the focus changed just a little bit. Underneath everything was a commitment to safety and science. We did not want anyone in our community, in our church community, to get sick because they'd come to church. And we were always looking at the science and what the Dane County and Madison Public Health people were saying. It was during this time that the re-entry task force was formed. So we were already looking ahead. We know we're going to be able to get back, but we need to have a group formed that can guide that process, that can do the deep reading, can investigate and explore different options that might help keep us safe as we return. At this time, we also recruited a lot of volunteers to place individual phone calls to members. I think almost all members were called. Just a check-in call. Hey, how are you doing? Do you need anything? We're thinking of you.
One of the things that we did is we asked the greeters to do these calls because they weren't greeting in worship. And we thought, well, maybe those might be people who might be open to greeting in a different way. And many of them did. Many of them were not able to do that as well. But it was just an instance of how do we take people who had committed to volunteer and wanted to be engaged, and they couldn't do that, and find a different way to use their gifts that would be meaningful to the community.
We started out asking people to make 7 phone calls. So I'd send out a list of 7 names. And often people would get those done and say, give me another 7. So I think the all-time record I think Gene Nilsson made about 37 calls in one session. We did this whole checking in calls thing twice. We did it in the summer and then we tried to do it again before Christmas. And one of those times, I think Gene Nelson made 37 calls. So he just kept emailing me, give me another set. Pastor Ken started Coffeeless Fellowship via Zoom. And I know for some people that was a wonderful way to be able to gather virtually and have a time to just chat and just connect with each other. There was a Bible study that Pastor Katie offered, and that was in the parking lot. We also had Christ in Our Home devotionals, which prior to the pandemic, many people were accustomed to just picking up when they came to church on Sunday. And so we recruited a team of volunteers who would take 10 to 12 copies, and we tried to divide them by parts of the city, and they would go out and develop and deliver those Christ in Our Home devotionals. I don't think we've been doing that lately. We haven't needed to, but our Pam has maintained a list of people who always want them automatically. And so she can kind of reserve those copies for people to come and pick up. There were tables outside under the entryway where people could drive up and pick up a devotional if they wanted, but we needed lots of volunteers to deliver those as well. It was summer 2020 that I began writing the potluck posts. I never really thought of myself as a writer, but I remember meeting with Pastor Katie and Pastor Blake and saying, you know, I have a job where I'm supposed to help connect people and I can't, it's really hard to know how to do that when we can't be together. What can I do? And I remember them saying, we would like you to write. And I was kind of taken aback by that because I was a math major. But I began writing potluck posts and we tried to send those out periodically. I think by the time I took a break from that, I think there are 27 of them now. And who knows, there may be an occasional one if the bug bites me. But that helped me process my feelings about the pandemic. And from, you know, I got really great feedback and responses from people. People would say, oh, I especially resonated with that one, or that really describes how I feel. So that was very affirming for me. We tried something which we call connection points, where once we were somewhat competent with Zoom, well, could we get small groups of people together via Zoom just to check in? Maybe people that weren't part of Coffeeless Fellowship, people that worked during the day and couldn't do Coffeeless Fellowship, maybe. We tried that. We had a little bit of interest, but I think we have one group of 4 that still meets. And they do kind of a Faith 5 reflection together based on a scripture passage. We wanted to make sure that we were caring for our neighbor. Hungry people were still hungry during the pandemic, if not more so. There were more hungry people. We placed the food pantry bin outside and that just kept filling up. So people were really trying to do things for others that were safe, that they could do. And then Brenda somehow created this amazing take-home kit for Vacation Bible School. There were videos involved, there were crafts involved, and we managed to have a Vacation Bible School. Some of the videos were taken like for a gathering time, still in the worship center. But it was amazing to see VBS happen virtually.
Laura?
Yeah.
One of the other things that we did as a group is that we had the adult forums continued throughout all of the summer. Oh, it should be. Is that better?
Yep.
One of the things that we did as a committee is that we had the adult forums go through the summer. And normally we are not operating in the summer. And I think we ended up with something like 40 some presentations during the year. So
Yeah, that was nice that kept going too. Any way that people could gather together, we wanted to keep going. So that was really fantastic that the adult forum was able to find speakers kind of at short notice, I think, and gather via Zoom. And I think at the beginning, I mean, people were really eager to connect virtually. There is some burnout with screens now, I'm afraid, but that was critical for that summer to have all these different opportunities that people could virtually connect with one another.
On the right, you just see a meme, I guess, is that how you say it? That's been going around the Lutheran churches throughout this time. It's a quote from Martin Luther, and someone's put a face mask over his face. This was from when the plague was going through Europe and Germany, and he said, "All of us have the responsibility of warding off this poison to the best of our ability, because God has commanded us to care for the body, to protect and nurse it, so that we are not exposed needlessly." So a little encouragement from Martin Luther back then. And you can see someone has written a chat about how the silver lining of the coffeeless fellowships. Yeah, I think for those who participated, those were really, really wonderful experiences. One of the things that I reminded when Laura mentioned that some of the Vacation Bible School videos, the openings were still filmed in the worship space. When we did our worship, we decided that we wanted to do it where we could film from the worship space, because even though the church is not a building, we heard so many people say that they appreciated still seeing the worship space during worship. Some churches use Zoom or other means where they weren't recording from the worship space. And I think for our congregation, people found it very meaningful to see the space. It gave them that feeling of that sense of connection in a way that maybe wouldn't have been the same if we were on Zoom doing our worship. So that was, I think, an important part of our worship experience. So in the midst of the whole COVID pandemic, we had in many ways, our lives upturned when we had a heightened realization of something that had been going on, with us all along, but the second pandemic of racism. We remember George Floyd, murdered May 25th, 2020. And the congregation was very supportive and wanted to really make a statement that we were a church that was seeking to combat racism and admit our faults, and also work to make the world a better place. And so the council created a statement of a reaffirmation of a commitment to combat racism, and you can still read that on our webpage. Over that summer and fall, we did a study on the book Dear Church, which is by an ELCA pastor, Lenny Duncan. The subtitle of that book is A Love Letter to the Whitest Denomination in America, which the ELCA is by percentage. Along with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we have the least number of non-white members in our congregations. And so what does that mean for us, and how we become a people that really is welcoming and creates a society of equity for all? And after that book study, a new ministry group formed, the Racial Justice Group, and they've been very active. They've led a couple adult forums and have been doing a series once a quarter now of education, and have also done a couple of direct support activities for the African American Black community in Madison. And so this also, I think, really stretched all of us when we were already stretched, as we realized some of the underlying struggles and equity that it was in our society that really came to the fore, and then the tension around that. And so it was an important time for us to respond as a church. The other things that we needed to figure out during this time were the important rites that we are about as God's people: Holy Communion, baptisms, weddings, and funerals. And when you couldn't gather as normal, how do you do that? So we had outdoor weddings. You can see this picture from a wedding that Pastor Katie presided at the Arboretum, with face masks. And we did baptisms in church and at people's homes with face masks, and we did them privately instead of obviously during the public worship, to provide for safety. So just the immediate family and maybe the sponsors and grandparents. And then we tried to figure out communion, and we ended up settling on these little communion kits that we distribute. First, we had them available for people to pick up and do at home when we were doing only online worship, so that people could have communion at home. And then we've been using them here for our worship on the second and fourth Sundays of each month, as well, for in-person worship, as a way to offer the sacrament, which we so sorely need as God's presence. The thing that we discovered, and we actually had a speaker from St. Olaf College talk about the theology behind the real presence through a virtual experience, that even though we hadn't maybe expected or thought about that in the past, we really can experience a connection with God and one another virtually, and that's no less of a real experience than meeting in person at times. And so, especially when that's the only option available, we can trust and believe that God's promise of God's presence and forgiveness is with us in the sacrament, even when it's mediated in a different way than we had been used to it. And so I think those were important. Funerals were probably the hardest part, because grieving people really need to be comforted and connected. And so we often would do a graveside service or a small family service, but a gathering was just not possible. Gary Williams was our first member who died during the pandemic, not from COVID, but just had passed away in early March, and the family had planned a service for late March, and we weren't able to do it. And so we had to wait until this last late spring when we finally were able to have a worship service that celebrated Gary's life. And that was very meaningful. But that time where you don't have that opportunity to grieve and to comfort and to be with one another has been hard. And I think that's one of the toughest parts of the pandemic. But these images, I think, give you a sense of some of the things that we experienced during this time.
Now, another phase then, it was fall of 2020. We'd found lots of things that worked. We found a few things that didn't work so great, but we were going to keep our ministries going. Sunday school started and kind of worked with the same model that had worked so successfully with Vacation Bible School, take-home kits and videos. It was challenging to keep choirs connected. The vocal choirs, especially, because we learned that singing was one of the riskiest things to do, especially indoors. So both of our choir directors began to meet with our choirs via Zoom. Sometimes they were just check in, how are you doing things? Sometimes they managed to find ways to sing. They would all go on mute and sing to themselves at home, but they could see one another singing. It was just a way to keep those relationships going, those connections going. The congregation raised funds really quickly for the Wakefield House program, for a formerly homeless family to live in our Wakefield house through the Road Homes Building Futures program. There was another study on Martin Luther's Freedom of a Christian. I think that was well attended, and people found that meaningful. As we started looking toward Christmas, we were able to get Tyrone Grieve to come to church. Boy, a lot of Sundays during this time to play for online worship.
And he plays the violin rather than a wind instrument or a brass or something. So a safe instrument to play. It was important to think about that.
We had confirmation in the parking lot. So in the last, since 2018, we had confirmation in the worship space. In 2020, we had it in the parking lot. And 2021, today at the 10:30 service, we will have it at Westmoreland Park. So we're finding a way for confirmation to happen. We had another round before Christmas of volunteer phone calls, and we had a wonderful stewardship campaign with some online videos. The photo on the left is one of my favorite photos. That is well, Heidi's not there, Heidi and Jan Bianca, and they're twins in the back. And their youngest daughter in front, you can see the youngest daughter has her baby doll. And then there's also a dinosaur and some kind of white little creature, all watching online Sunday school.
And you can see on the right, someone watching worship with their coffee and muffin from their patio. So there were some benefits, I guess, for this online worship as well. So I think some people got very used to and enjoyed having that opportunity too. In addition, in the fall, we did Advent kits. So you can see the bags that we gave away for families and children and adults that were different activities to do during the Advent season since we couldn't gather. A planned hum along was canceled because again, the COVID was surging at that time. So we just sent out a video and invited people to sing Silent Night on their doorsteps. We passed out these yard signs to help the community know that we were still active and that we were a place that was seeking to share hope and a message of welcome and care for everyone. The Sunday school